Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Agile Service Delivery. I'm your host, Marlena Lombardi, and on behalf of IIBA, thanks for joining us today. Today's webinar is a public event. It is designed to deliver practical resources for you as you continue to hone your skill set and deliver value within your organization. When you join IIBA, you become a member of an international association dedicated to developing and promoting the business analysis profession, with access to resources and community to support your development and career growth. At IIBA, we are all about uniting a community of professionals to create better business outcomes and to provide the tools to help you climb the ladder of success. And you being here today is a testament to just that. Today, our presenter is Michael Boyle, Head of Procural Solutions. Acting very often as the bridge between the business and IT, Michael has thrived in working for various global organizations, allowing for the opportunity to work with people on 5 continents. Michael heads Procural Solutions, an organization focusing on business analysis, agile frameworks, and project management for both medium and large-sized multinational organizations. Originally from Los Angeles, he has been living in Vienna for the last 28 years and brings over 30 years of experience as a manager, trainer, coach, consultant, and practitioner, both regionally and globally. Today, Michael will describe what Agile Service Delivery is, what challenge it addresses, the conditions required for its proper deployment, and how it works, as well as providing some examples of tools and techniques used and what kind of results you can expect in using this approach. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions. So if you have any pop up during the presentation, please enter them into the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. Now with that, I would like to introduce Michael Boyle.
Marlena, thank you very much for the very kind words. Thank you all for joining today. And without further ado, let's move on to the webinar. What does our agenda look like for today? First of all, I'd like to, of course, explain the terminology, that being, of course, what Agile is about, and also what service delivery actually entails. What is our current situation today? What are the problems or pain points that many corporations are being confronted with? My proposal, ways that we can actually go ahead and address these issues, taking an agile approach towards service delivery. And then lastly, I'd like to go ahead and concentrate on what the role is of a business analyst within this framework. Before I start with that, I'd like to go ahead and talk a little bit about a book that came out 1997, 1998 called the Clue Train Manifesto. It's one of those seminal books, at least for me, where I understood how technology was changing the way that we actually look at the relationship with our customers. And these actions were taking place without upper management actually being aware of what those conversations actually look like between the people of the organization and the actual customers. Quote is as follows: "Conversations among human beings sound human. They are conducted in a human voice." And for me, that is the motivation of actually going ahead and putting together this concept. As mentioned, let's first start off with definitions. Many of you might be familiar with this diagram. It's called the triple constraint. And within projects, we say that if you were to change one part of the diagram, that has an effect on the others. So the part that I have crossed out is actually scope, the others being cost and time. Now within an agile framework, we change the scope to be value, which means that the traditional rules that you find within the triple constraint no longer apply. If we're not able to go ahead and produce value that's commensurate to the cost and the time required to actually go ahead and put that value together, then in essence, there's no meaning for the recipient of that, of what we're actually putting together. The key within service delivery, and certainly looking at it from an agile service delivery perspective, is ensuring that the customer is in the middle. Now, I know that you've probably heard that terminology very often, but the real fact is that we give this lip service, and in essence, the customer is not really the focus of what we're trying to accomplish. Very often in corporations, it's actually going ahead and trying to complete our tasks, complete our processes, and in essence, that's the outcome that we're looking for. No mention of customer whatsoever. One thing I like to point out, especially with Agile, and this is something that came to me rather recently, and especially looking at Agile processes, that we're trying to take a scientific approach. What do I actually mean by this term, scientific approach? It means that we're always trying to measure whether what we intended to do was actually being accomplished. And validation and metrics is a key component of taking on Agile as a way of working. So for me, that has everything to do with science. What you're looking at your screen right now is a typical diagram to be found within ITIL. If you're familiar with ITIL, IT information libraries, where we have various processes that we fulfill to ensure that the service delivery is actually taking place. And as I mentioned earlier, the real problem is that we're so concerned about actually just going ahead and completing these tasks, we forget for whom we're actually completing the tasks for. This model is supposed to change the way we look at it. And in fact, there's one component that many of us tend to forget when completing our day-to-day activities, especially when I think about the personal interactions I have with all kinds of companies, where they feel that I don't have a choice. I have to deal with this company. And the fact is, we always have a choice. We might not necessarily like the choice that we have, but we always have one. And that's something that we have to be very cognizant of. Again, on this journey that I've been taking time to Agile, and thinking about, well, we need to come up with some way to set order within that of what we're trying to do. So standardization is actually very important. The problems start when the standardization becomes a means to an end. And we see this within many companies today, that they feel that coming up with more standardized process makes them more efficient and then makes them run a better business. But there's an ugly flip side to the overreaching focus on standardization. We live in a dynamic environment, as we hear quite often, and we're experiencing this in our day-to-day activities, and that requires us to have a certain amount of flexibility in how we actually go ahead and manage that of what we do. So if we're not able to come up with systems that allow us to be flexible, trying to come up with the best solutions for those people that we're actually trying to service, then the model has little to no value to those recipients. So the real key here is to make sure that you have a balance between the standardization that we need to have in some fashion, plus the flexibility to make sure that that of what we're actually delivering brings value. Within our situation today, we've been working with a number of models, and we assume because it's always worked that way, that that's the way that we do business. But the fact is that although it's still taking time to come to full fruition, these models are proving to be antiquated. Let me go ahead and describe to you the model that we're looking at here on your screen right now. It's called Porter's Five Forces. It comes from Michael Porter, who is still a professor at Harvard University, and this model was established in 1980. Let me go ahead and describe to you what you see on your screen. Starting at the middle, and this is very typical, we have, of course, the industry where our focus is, and you'll have your competitors. And basically the focus is actually on that of what we're doing and how well we compare to those competitors we have. In fact, when I think of a number of assignments that I have had over the years and still get today, if I'm asked to go ahead and perform some sort of benchmarking, it's usually against competitors, either being market share or revenue, customer satisfaction, et cetera, et cetera. But the focus really is in how we actually square up against our competitors. Let's start with the box over on the left-hand side, suppliers. So the suppliers go ahead and supply to your business and obviously to competitors. And the fact is that the suppliers could theoretically be a competitor as well. I've been in businesses where that's very often been the case. And depending upon how successful our business is or the industry where we find ourselves to be in, and the leverage that the supplier has, well, the bargaining power can change based upon those conditions. Then, of course, on the right-hand side, we have the buyer or the customer. And a similar situation ensues where if we're offering something that is in high demand, we feel that the buyer doesn't have much of a say. We can expect much more of a margin. And with that, it's really questioning who's controlling the relationship. The box on the top, potential entrants, which we tend to forget until it's too late. And then lastly, the box on the bottom, substitutes, where it's always about what we're offering vis-a-vis what other alternatives our buyers might have. The fact is that this model is no longer relevant. Let me explain to you why. If you think about a number of our most popular applications today, very often we will have the buyers and the suppliers all participating within the platform, but they could be the same person. If you take the concept of a platform where we have suppliers that being, let's stay with an example like Airbnb. Remember an example that I suspect that most of you are familiar with. Somebody will be offering an extra room. And so the question is the network effect. How many suppliers and how many buyers are actually using the platform? Can a supplier be a buyer? Or a buyer or supplier? Of course, you can be looking to rent out an additional room, but you will also be traveling, so you will need a room. And so the fact is that this is all taking place in the middle. And in fact, within the platform, your suppliers and your buyers are the producers. Let's concentrate on the potential entrants. And here we have a number of examples that have taken place since the inception of the internet, where a number of companies have been blindsided because they could not imagine that there could be a potential entrant. Just think of all of the applications and the hardware that Apple has put together. That's only one example. And we see this taking place much more today, specifically tied to digitalization. And we've all found out very quickly that there are a number of substitutes that those buyers actually have at their disposal. And so with that, if we look at specifically looking at a platform, this model no longer applies. So how does service delivery actually go ahead and come into the mix here? When you have your suppliers and the buyers actually going ahead and offering their services, consuming those services over a platform that you are managing. Here's one example. For those of you who have never seen such a device, this is a 3D printer. And so I was talking to one of my friends here in Vienna, and he was explaining to me, actually showed me his 3D printer, and he explained to me how he actually goes ahead and uses this application. And he was kind enough to actually come up with a drawing for me. So let me go ahead and explain to you that of what you have on your screen right now. So he will be on whatever device he might choose, be it a PC or a tablet or a smartphone, and he will go to another site, supply the model that he would like, or perhaps he would pick out the model that he was looking to produce from a catalog that the supplier or the business actually was offering him at that period of time. And so he would go ahead and place the offer. Of course, this would be placed within the cloud. And he would also go ahead and direct where the product was to be produced. So if we look at this diagram going from the lower right, actually placing the order, to the cloud where the transaction's actually taking place, through the businesses offering the service, and then of course the last part, the lower left, the actual production of that of what he was actually ordering. Now, can you imagine, this was a pretty simple transaction actually, that you would have the possibility of making multiple orders that could theoretically be customized, and they would be produced at multiple touch points, and of course there are no boundaries, right? This could be global. Again, I raised the question, so what is service delivery under this particular model? There's one misconception that we have very often, and that is confusing service and value. Now, we can offer a multitude of different services to our client. And they might go ahead and tell us that they see all kinds of value in that of what we're actually offering. But the question is, do we have a means by which we can measure whether there's truly value in the service that we're actually delivering? A case in point, if you are running a website similar to, say, an Amazon, where the order is taking place, that could be coming from your own warehouse or perhaps from a third party. And of course, all of us would love to know exactly where our package is at a certain period of time. If we were to think that the more information we pass on to the consumer is bringing value, the fact is, if the consumer doesn't retrieve that data, or doesn't, the customer might look at the screen and say, oh, that's good to know, but in essence, it's not mission critical for the consumer, then yes, you're offering a service, but in essence, if you weren't offering that service, it wouldn't be missed. So I raised the question, offering services that the customer wouldn't miss, would that be value? I suspect not. Now, of course, how do we actually go ahead and figure out what the value is and really what those customer needs are? And of course, within frameworks such as the BABOK, we try to come up with different ways to better understand who those stakeholders are and how we establish those needs. And I always try to take a little bit of a different approach. And so here's one of the examples, especially looking at what service is and what value is to the individual. And this is a concept that has been around for a number of years. Well, this is a Japanese word called oikudadachi, and it means walking in the customer's shoes. And so the idea is, and they were one of the forerunners of understanding empathy. They didn't go ahead and put together empathy maps. They didn't need to, but the whole key was, do you have a real understanding of what your customers are actually going through so that you can better understand what their needs are? Now, again, relating this to an agile framework, when we talk about what our goals are within agile and how we actually go ahead and perform these tasks, the answer is that we focus on the individuals and the interactions so that we have a better understanding of what they're looking for, what their needs are, and how they actually perceive value to be. Another technique that I suspect some of you are familiar with, and that's coming out of various fields. Probably the most predominant one today would be design thinking. That would be persona analysis. And the idea is that we're able to go ahead and put together, we're looking at it from a typical business analysis perspective. After we've gone ahead and constructed our stakeholder map, we've put our stakeholders into various categories or different groups. The idea is that we're able to go ahead and paint a picture of who that stakeholder is within that stakeholder group so that we can better relate to who that individual is. So then within persona analysis, and there are various ways to actually go ahead and perform the exercise. Very typically, we'll go ahead and put a picture to our persona so that we can better identify with him or her. And there will be certain categorization that will go ahead and take place. But there are 4 main questions that need to be asked so that we have a better feeling vis-a-vis that of what we're trying to accomplish and how the persona actually goes ahead and looks at that of what we're trying to deliver. And that would be think, see, feel, and do. Let me go ahead and describe to you the meaning of these 4 words. And let's use an example of something that you're offering within your business, and you're trying to get a better idea of how that persona group actually goes ahead and views that. So what is the persona thinking? The persona might be thinking about something completely different. And in fact, they're not interested in spending more time dealing with you than they actually need to. And you might think, again, looking at the slide that I presented a little bit earlier, service is not the same as value. If you bombard them with service, actually you might be taking their time from them, and they will look at that as being negative. So if you're running a shop, if the persona walks in the door, they might think, oh, I cannot find what I'm looking for. Why is it always so complicated every time I come to the store? Or they might think, oh, and then this is very typical where I live. When does the store close? Because if I'm not able to get there in time, then it ruins the rest of my day. Very possibly that persona might be thinking, actually, I wish that it would just appear on my doorstep without me actually having to think about it. And we have various examples today, especially if one looks at the technology tied to the Internet of Things, where you can establish sensors on various appliances or various parts of your home, for example, so that you can actually go ahead and let the information be passed on to the supplier so that you don't even have to think about ordering something. Let's move on to the second point, that would be C, which are basically the influencers of the persona. So who influences that persona? Stay with the example. Somebody who is a typical consumer of your business will have, if it's on the consumer level, then that would be the family members, very possibly people within his or her personal acquaintance group where they would look at them as being early adopters. And if those influencers will go ahead and say, oh, that's a great product. Oh, I have to tell you about something I just discovered. Well, for this persona group, they will be thinking, ah, if they liked it, then I'm surely to like it as well. Let's move on to the third part, which would be feel. So this persona might be having feelings that, again, might not directly be relating to your product or service that you're offering, but in essence, play a very important role in how they perceive that of what you're actually running as a business. Maybe question of time or question of stress. These are typical components that fall within that feel category. I never have enough time to complete everything I want to do. Or my boss is never happy with that of what I actually offer. Or does anybody really care about what I do? Okay, let's move on to the last part, which would be the do part. So how are they managing today? In essence, we're never really 100% happy with whatever our situation is, and inevitably we come up with various workarounds. And through time, we assume that the workaround is the standard process because we don't know any better. And of course, for us who are trying to enhance the product or the service for this persona group, if we can come up with something that they didn't even think was possible, well, how does that affect the other three parts of the persona analysis equation? Then all of a sudden, their feelings go ahead and change. Oh man, that was so easy. I didn't think that was possible. And very possibly this persona might be an influencer to somebody else. And they'll go ahead and tell people within their acquaintances, you have to check this out. This is a great time saver. Now, of course, within organizations, we have different customers that have different touch points within your company. Let me give you an example of something typical of the businesses that I've been involved in. You will have the end user who will be contacting a contact center. You will have the person in procurement who actually purchased the solution. You will have the people in accounting that will deal with the accounting department, with your own accounting department. You might have a technical team that either might be dealing with the end user or perhaps with a technical team from your customer or your client. And the fact is that within your own organization very often, or at least in the case that I've run across, you might be fortunate, I wasn't always so fortunate, that they all worked in different departments, right? So that meant that they never really talked to each other. And they had no visibility of what that entire customer experience was for the individual stakeholders and how you were actually being perceived. So the question is, can we turn a negative into a positive? And so I came up with a concept, I call it catalog mining. Let me go ahead and explain what that is. First of all, going back to the concept of service delivery, we developed what's called a service catalog, which is basically a listing of all of the services that we offer, and very possibly we might be offering certain services to certain clients. Certainly, clients will go ahead and make a choice as to which services they actually want to go ahead and purchase from you. But what you really want to do is try to exploit as much as you can the services that you can offer to a client. I talked about value earlier. Now, I ask you a question: are the consumers actually aware of what that value is? Sometimes they might be very cognizant, but very often the real driver isn't something that they would call value. But the real question is, to what degree that of what you're offering, and looking at all of those touch points I just mentioned to you, have you made this part of their routine? So how do we do this? As I mentioned, we have different customer touch points within the organization. And they do the work, and very often they will never talk to the other people that are dealing with that same customer. Now, within Agile, we talk about developing cross-functional teams. So what would happen if you were to go ahead and, first of all, put together a map of all those customer touch points? Take one of your customers, go ahead and list all of the parts of your business and which parts are the customer actually dealing with. And then, of course, you would go ahead and try to define the persona commensurate to those activities within your organization. Bring them together. Here's your opportunity to go ahead and create a cross-functional team. Explain to them your exercise, and I firmly believe this is an activity that a business analyst would truly excel at. If you believe that facilitation is one of our greatest gifts as business analysts, then this exercise clearly falls into line. So let's go ahead and get these people together, get them talking about the customer, give them an opportunity to have a free discussion in really understanding, so what difficulties do you think this customer has? And I'm not necessarily referring to the typical ones, what problems they have in the different departments. That one should be assumed. But use the resources you have within your organization to truly have a better understanding of your customer, taking a 360-degree view, and go ahead and list those pain points. Now take that information and see, well, are there any additional products or services that we can actually go ahead and offer a customer to alleviate some of those pain points? In performing this exercise, and for me this is truly taking an agile approach, it allows you to build that cross-functional team, allow the individuals a certain amount of autonomy. What am I referring to here? That you give them the power to go ahead and make those things that those wishes that they have, those concerns they have, give them an avenue for them to actually go ahead and make a difference. And of course, if they're going ahead and making all of these decisions in that of what you're actually offering at the end, then of course you already have a buy-in. But this is a great opportunity, especially for those businesses that are traditionally moving from product-based. Think about the Porter's 5 Forces. That is pretty much a product-based model. And if we move from going from products to services, which is for me a basic tenet of digitalization, then you have the opportunity to offer your clients even more services with a way of making your service, making your offering, so to speak, indispensable. So here's that's an example of how you can actually turn a negative into a positive. Another way to approach the issue is performing an exercise that I call a service market fit. Now, just think about the example I gave you concerning the catalog mining. And so we've gone ahead and we have the products and the services. We have an idea of who our customers are, drilling down to the persona level, understanding what they're thinking, what they're seeing, what they're feeling, and how they're managing things today. And try to develop a better understanding of what those pains are, what kind of jobs they're trying to complete, and of course, what possible gains you can actually bring those customers in those products and services that you're actually developing. Now, one of the key problems that we run across very often in service delivery today, and I believe that at least for some of you, I will be describing a very common story, one that you can definitely relate to. How often have you called any of the businesses that you deal with, and you end up on the automated voice recognition, where you're being routed to whatever what the system believes is the department who is actually going ahead and solving your issue. And of course, the system is assuming that you only have one issue. And if you're like me, inevitably, if I have to call somebody, I don't come with one. I come with a number of issues that need to be solved. And so you'll go ahead and perform the exercises tied to the IVR, and you will end up in one department. Now, the system might be right, might be wrong, but inevitably you end up with somebody who will have a limited knowledge based upon whatever their specialty is. You will explain the issue that needs to be solved, and perhaps it might be a little bit more complicated, and you will need to deal with multiple departments. Well, the classic is that you end up talking to multiple touch points within the service center, and you will need to go ahead and, in spite of the fact that the information was passed on from customer service representative A to customer service representative B, you feel that you need to explain the entire story, or the wrong questions were being asked. But the fact today is, and that's very typical of what we would consider to be an ITIL model, where we would have our first level support, second level support, third level support, where we would go from incident to problem to change request. But today, the model looks different. If you could see over on the left-hand side, that's pretty much the process that we've been following for a number of years now, where we would go from level 1, level 2, level 3, and the whole idea would be, if somebody in level 1 can complete it, that's great. But inevitably, it will end up on second or third level, which means that the customer needs to wait. Today, it's starting to look a lot different. If you look at the model over on the right-hand side, it's called swarming, where we have multiple touch points within your organization. Will it have the ability to go ahead and solve the problem? So the real question is, do we need to take such a linear approach, clearly to be found over on the left-hand side, or can we go ahead and put the customer in the middle, the issue that the customer actually has in the middle, and allowing your structure to determine who is the best person to actually go ahead and solve the issue. So we're looking more at a network structure and not necessarily a hierarchy model. And of course, this is very agile, because we're not basing it upon some sort of structure to be found within an org chart, but rather we're focusing more on having whoever the person in your organization who can best deal with that issue, the opportunity to go ahead and try to solve it quickly. And so that means that the approach that we take is going to be much different. those processes that we have that have always been seen as being linear don't necessarily apply. And I felt the whole idea of a pit stop really allows us to better understand how do we go ahead and approach that. So if you can assume that the race car is the customer, and we have, of course, all of the participants, those working in the pit stop, trying to ensure that the car can actually go ahead and get back on the track as quickly as possible. Everybody will have their jobs. They will not go ahead and say, well, that's not my job, I don't need to deal with it, because they all have a common goal, and that is getting that car back onto the road. Then you ensure that the people that are actually going ahead and performing the activities have the right focus. And in fact, I believe that this is the direction that we're actually moving, especially tied to customer delivery. So the key indicator for me is we're not looking at hierarchy anymore. We're looking at actually being outcome oriented and making sure that everyone within the organization is focusing and making sure that that outcome is actually being achieved. And for me, that's very much agile. A topic that is very hot today is tied to a concept that's called DevOps. Let me go ahead and explain this to you. We have the problem within IT today that development and IT operations are very often are feuding, because development is just keen on getting the software out the door. IT operations isn't involved in that process. So development will throw something over to IT operations. They will go ahead and look at the package, and we'll have to deal with a number of problems that ensued because they were not considered to be a key stakeholder. Furthermore, we have two departments where they're concerned about what's happening in their own department. And again, the focus is no longer on the customer. It's a great model, but there are a couple of problems with it. It's very, very strict in that it only really deals with IT. Now, if you think about some of the comments I made earlier, especially looking at the customer touch points, are development and IT operations the only departments that have an effect on the customer experience? And I think the real issue is that we need to have other stakeholders involved within your organization. And they should be all of those touch points that I was talking about earlier. And if we're really going to come up with a cross-functional team, then it should go far beyond IT. Another key component to be found within Agile, and this has to clearly be part of a service delivery model, is this idea of continuous delivery. Because as soon as we're able to go ahead and get something out the door to the customer, we can best measure their satisfaction. And of course, we run across projects where we've been doing something new, and so we really don't know what that customer satisfaction level actually is going to be. But one thing's for sure, as soon as we're able to go ahead and present them something, the sooner we could find out whether we met their needs or not. And of course, that's all well and good, but part of the difficulties that we have is that we're going to have different goals within the organization, and we need to be very cognizant of making sure that we reach all of those goals. And that sometimes is very difficult in our day-to-day activities. Let's go through the list that I have on the screen, and then I'll talk about the difference between important and urgent. And of course, the short-term goals will be coming from operations because they might have an issue that needs to be dealt with, and that would fall much more into the urgent category. It doesn't have to be, but very often is the case. Now, when we move farther along within the organization, we'll be looking at those important components, those medium-term goals that could be coming from operations, but most likely will be coming from middle management. Then, of course, the long-term goals that are tied to the vision and the mission and the strategy and, of course, the objectives that will be coming primarily from upper management. And so the fact is that what might be considered important for upper management might not be considered important for operations, because they're more concerned about the urgent things that need to be taken care of. The real issue is we only concentrate on the urgent and we never get to the important. So we need to be able to understand, especially tied to what our customers are going through, how do we actually go ahead and manage that? So within continuous delivery, it allows us to answer some very important questions and understanding. Another term that we use very often within Agile, in fact, it's a basic tenet of Agile, is what we call the definition of done. And of course, if we can't define it, we don't know if we've done it or not. And the real question is, what's most important? Our definition of done, or what the definition of done is of the recipient? So if we're focused on the customer and what they consider to be done, then we don't care as much about what falls within our job description, but rather we're more concerned about the outcome that we're trying to generate for the customer. Now, of course, we can't reach done unless we can define what ready is. Very often we try to start with projects or assignments, and we don't have all that's required to actually go ahead and make it happen. So we know what done is, but we can't get ready to be done. And basically that's where we have all of our impediments. Very often the problem is that we think about these things way too big, instead of actually breaking them down into things that we can actually go ahead and accomplish, and figure out ways to get rid of those impediments so that we can get done quicker. Again, continuous delivery allows us to do this much better because we have something to measure. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a firm believer that science has a very important role in the way that we go ahead and measure our success. Allows us to go ahead and make corrections and do it better the next time. Of course, the value that's perceived by the customer plays a very important role, and those benefits that we're actually going ahead and producing along the ways. We can measure this all much better by using continuous delivery instead of actually planning until we get to the point where we feel that we can execute. By that point in time, very often the customer's given up. Another concept I thought about quite often has been tied to this whole idea of what business rules actually are and how do we go ahead and enforce them. And very often, I'm sure you've been confronted with a situation where a business rule has been established, and this is another key component of service delivery, where rules have been created, but we don't have processes to actually go ahead and enforce them. So the rules are there to define and steer behavior, and the processes are the vehicles by which we actually go ahead and make it happen. So what's the value of having business rules that can't be enforced? And I think that's something that I feel that I'm confronted with numerous times in a week. And I always think that, have these people actually thought these things through? So how do we go ahead and create different models that allow us to look at this better? And so I started playing with the concept of impact mapping and actually applying it to an assessment of business rules, and specifically looking at it from a customer perspective. So let's start from the left, move on to the right. So why do we have the rule? And who is supposed to be the recipient of the rule, or whose behavior are we actually trying to change? How are we trying to manage that? Again, looking at the processes. Now, if we can't go ahead and enforce it, then it doesn't really matter. And then lastly, what are we actually expecting from these business rules? Now, I haven't seen this very often, that companies have actually gone ahead and gone through the effort to evaluate their business rules. And again, I'm looking at this primarily from a customer perspective. But this one could be a real eye-opener. Now, again, looking at this from an agile perspective, and of course, very often we will concentrate on a method that is to be found within IT called Scrum. I won't go into detail what Scrum is about, but give you a general description. The idea is that we can define what can be done within a certain period of time. You get the commitment of the team to go ahead and make that happen. And you measure how successful you were in actually completing the work you said you could within a 2 to 4 week period. The real problem in using a model like that within service delivery is that these requests that we receive from the customer doesn't really fit into this model. Can you imagine a customer calling you or writing you a mail or whatever means of communication they might use, and they will say, I would like to have this completed. And if you were to go back to them and say, oh, I'm sorry, our team is in the middle of a sprint, and you probably don't even go through the effort to explain what you're talking about. You use acronyms or internal phraseology that you found within your organization, said, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait 2 to 4 weeks, and then we'll have to go ahead and evaluate. Well, you can imagine what kind of warm and fuzzy feeling you will go ahead and leave those customers. So the fact is, we need to constantly evaluate the importance of what needs to be done. And the goal is to get it out to the customer quicker. So I believe that Kanban is a much better model. Let me go ahead and explain to you what I'm actually referring to from Kanban. This is a method coming primarily from lean methodology that was developed in Japan starting in the late 40s, coming more into fruition around the 60s, and a very basic model, that of what I'm using here, you would go ahead and put together the tasks that need to be completed into 3 categories: to do, doing, and done. So the to-do part allows you to better estimate how much work you have. The doing part allows you to better manage what you're able to complete within a certain period of time. And then lastly, of course, the done is what was actually completed. By following the path within the Kanban board, you can actually measure how quickly you can move from to do to done. There are all kinds of other elements that we can add to a Kanban board, adding priority, classes of cards, et cetera, but I personally believe that something along these lines, whatever type of service delivery that you're actually talking about, is much more efficient than trying to come up with a model where you clearly define certain work that will be completed within a specific time frame. As I mentioned, with our focus, of course, being on business analysis, well, how does this all play into the roles that we have as business analysts? Well, first of all, there are all kinds of requirements, and that of what I've been describing. And somebody needs to go ahead and collect the requirements. I already know I'm speaking to the converted here, in that a business analyst is the person who has the most expertise with regards to actually going in collecting those requirements and putting them together in a meaningful fashion. So we still have plenty of requirements, and somebody needs to go ahead and complete that. That, of course, would be the BA. Now, this is my personal take, that I think that business analysts have a lot to do with transformation. If you think about who knows the current state the best and what those needs are, well, basically the transformation is moving from the current to the future state. Now, the BA is not the project manager, or you might be a project manager too. I've had both positions numerous times. But the fact is, the BA is really the person who puts together that initial scope statement. So a business analyst has a lot to do about transformation, in my personal opinion. Understanding the value and ensuring that the value is actually met is a basic component of what we find within the BABAC. And then going back to the history of the BABAC, and I remember when I went ahead and got my CBAP, it was BABAC 2, and of course there was a very strong focus on the testing and the role that the BA played within the testing process. Well, certainly within this type of model, who is the best person to understand how we go ahead and measure the satisfaction? Well, I find the capabilities to be found within the business analyst role to be very well suited to these types of activities. Okay, and let me check the time. Didn't do too bad, 7:51, that's 1951 Vienna time. I'm done for now and would welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you, Michael. We do have a couple of questions.
Great.
What are the best practices in delivering agile in government agencies that you would suggest?
The best practices in government agencies. Well, I think this is very suiting to service delivery, because who are the government agencies servicing? They're the constituency, right? And so the real question is whether these government agencies have that customer focus. Why are they actually there? And I hope I'm not going to stir a revolution with some of these comments I'm going to make. But the fact is, the government agencies are to service the individuals within that community. And so the first step has to be, who are the people within our community? What are their needs? And how could we best go ahead and fulfill those needs? And I believe that an agile service delivery mindset is ideal, where they can actually understand. So can we group them into stakeholders, have a better understanding of what these groups are, perhaps even perform a persona analysis, so that we understand what these pain points are of people in our community. Can we come up with solutions that best supply that service to our customers? And for me, that has to be a basic tenet of agile best practice for government organizations.
Perfect. That's good. Request regarding Kanban. Could Michael give some examples or explain with a little bit more detail the Kanban model to do and doing?
Sure, of course. Now, of course, we have always a number of tasks, but of course they can't always be completed at once because we have natural constraints. I'll tell you a story. If you think about it, if you were to go ahead and throw a ball at a dog, well, the dog can pretty much catch the ball. If you were to throw 2 balls, the dog probably will catch them. Maybe if you have a very talented dog, the dog might even be able to catch 3. Try throwing 10 balls at a dog and see what happens. The fact is, the dog is going to be completely overwhelmed because the dog doesn't know which ball to actually concentrate on. So the idea, in fact, let me go back to the Kanban board because I have the control here. And it makes it a little bit easier for me to talk about something that you can actually visualize. So the idea is that you cannot do everything at once. Let's take into consideration those ideas that I mentioned, or those concepts I mentioned, definition of done and definition of ready. Now, there might be a number of tickets that you will have on the to-do side that are not ready. You might have impediments. And so there's no point in moving a task that needs to be done to the doing part if you cannot do it. So it allows us to take more of a systematic approach, point number one. Point number two, as I mentioned with the example of the dog can't catch 10 balls at the same time. And you know what, a human being is no different. Speaking from personal experience, and I suspect you will find yourselves to all be in that same category, if you're given 10 tasks to do, then the first thought is you're overwhelmed. You don't know which task to do first. Okay, then the first thing you do is you organize them. You probably put some sort of priority to the task. But the fact is, you cannot work in multiple tasks, and I'm talking about a number of tasks, at the same time and be efficient. There's an exercise that I use quite often with training, and it's having people go ahead and write down numbers in a row, and then you're asked to go ahead and change pens in writing the numbers. So of course, you have to take one pen, write down a number, take a different colored pen, write down the next number. That's not a very efficient way of doing it. So aren't we better off trying to group things that we can do efficiently, get them over to the done part, which allows us to actually go ahead and bring value. The problem is that we, as individuals, we keep thinking that if we're not able to do things the way they're given to us, then we're not capable. And we're not doing a good job. But that's a fallacy. The idea is to do the work efficiently and not necessarily base it upon some sort of idea that doesn't bring value. So if you concentrate on value, it's getting it to the done part quicker. And we can't do too many things at once. So let's concentrate on those things that we can do efficiently and get them over to done. And then, of course, done is done. And done allows us to actually go ahead and measure how effective we actually were at the end. And taking this concept and adding timestamps to the Kanban cards allows you to actually manage what we call the throughput. Going from the to-do, landing on the to-do column, how quickly you're able to get them ready to be done, how quickly you're able to do them, and how quickly and how long did the entire process take from the to-do to the done. You can measure efficiency very well. That's very interesting that people are interested in Kanban. I really like this tool, and I strongly suggest in whatever way you can to try to use it yourself. I'm not keen on promoting any tools. I can only give you an example of one that I've used quite often. It's called Trello. It's a free tool where you're able to go ahead and build your own Kanban board. And I use it for personal projects as well, so that I can have a better overview of what I actually need to do, and I understand that I can't do it all at the same time. You might want to give it a try.
Perfect. I have a question from Florin. What is the role of prototyping in agile software development?
Ooh, very important. The idea, and of course, prototyping takes on different forms. You can go ahead and come up with a mock-up, which would also be a prototype, which would be more of a visual representation to give the recipient a better idea of what you have in mind. I can move past the Kanban board, go back to the questions. It allows you, especially as a BA, to better understand whether you understood the needs properly, because there's something to be said about the visual form. And of course, a prototype allows us to go ahead and make those concepts visual, what the actual possible solution would be. And of course, within prototyping, you can theoretically, you have the possibility of coming up with a throwaway prototype, or something that it's an evolutionary prototype. In other words, based upon the requirements and making sure that you're only taking care of those things that you can get out the door, and the continuous validation, put together only the features that you can do in a certain period of time, put them into a prototype, get your validation, then you go to the next batch, and so at the end, that prototype will be a finished product. And of course, if we move it outside of the agile software development phase, where we're looking at prototyping in a big way tied to creating hardware, or any type of physical components, where you can actually, today you can go ahead and use a prototype for something physical that you actually go ahead and create. So it's a basic tenet, and I'm only covering the surface tied to prototyping, but I hope that helped out a little bit.
Perfect. And with that, it is 2 o'clock, and I do have to apologize for those who joined. Apparently my computer clock was 5 minutes fast, so we actually started the webinar 5 minutes before every other device said. So
oh my God. We're running overtime. Well, in any case, thank you very much all for sticking around. I'll make the last real quick. For those of you who might not just be involved in business analysis, but have other hats that you have to wear, I went to and put together a course on for LinkedIn Learning and lynda.com on program management. If you're interested, please feel free to go ahead and check that out. If you are living in the United States or Canada, Australia, I believe as well, some other parts, with a library card, you can actually view the course for free via lynda.com. So please feel free to go ahead and reach out to that. I've also put together courses on Udemy tied to business analysis, some of the concepts that we talked about today, but primarily looking at various tools and techniques and taking a bit of a different approach. For those of you who are interested, I will give you my contact details. Please feel free to reach out to me. I have discount codes that I'd be more than happy to pass on to anyone who participated in this webinar or anybody who might be viewing it at a later date. So please reach out to me. And again, lastly, here are my contact details. Thank you very much for attending today. I enjoyed putting together these webinars, and I hope that I actually brought you some added value. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Michael, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. If you did miss the beginning of this, again, I apologize. It started earlier on my computer than, like I said, every other device. We will post this on the IABA website within 5 business days of the presentation with the slide deck that you see here, as well as the recording of the webinar. And again, thank you so much, Michael, for joining us, and everybody have a lovely day.